So I'm Steve Todrick, and I'm from Northumbria. Sorry, I seem to have lost my voice. From Northumbria University. I'm a professor of immunology there. And it's a great pleasure tonight to be able to introduce to you my colleague at Northumbria, Patrick Randolph-Quinney. I think I'll let Patrick tell you a bit about himself to you himself, rather than me try and make a hash of trying to tell his biography. But Patrick recently joined us at Northumbria from the University of Central Lancaster. And so Patrick's been traveling around the world with his study of human evolution. Patrick's now an associate professor of forensic science in our Department of Applied Sciences in Northumbria. And Patrick's the title of his talk today is "How Landscape Impacted on the Evolution of Humans and Humanness." So thanks again, Patrick, very much for talking to us tonight, and I'll hand over to you.
Thank you very much. Okay, thanks, Stephen. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Good evening, everybody. And I've got a case of ear infection at the moment, which I'm taking antibiotics for. So it means I get a little bit at times. So I might have to pause and clear my sinuses at some stage, but hopefully not too much. Right, so I'm going to share my screen with you now, and you can all see that. Right, so I'll introduce myself. The talk itself is basically about the interaction between landscape, so the space through which we move as a species, and how that's affected the evolution of our own species, Homo sapiens. And I'm going to focus on an area that I know incredibly well, which is the Makapansgat region in South Africa. Part of this is discussion of biology, part of it's discussion of human evolution, archaeology, but it's also kind of travel log as well. See what you make of it. So I need to introduce to put somebody beforehand though. This is my rather old curmudgeonly 15-year-old dog Gromit. So if you hear in the background heavy barking, it's him. He's 15 years old. He's traveled halfway around the world, straight from Ireland, lived in South Africa. Now it's back here in the UK. And he basically can't hear anything. So if he starts barking at anything around outside the house, he keeps barking until such time as he just tires himself out. So hopefully he'll be quiet. But if you do hear anything, that's him talking. Right. So I am going to introduce myself a little bit. As Steve said, I'm associate professor of forensic science. I'm an archaeologist and particularly a biological anthropologist by training. So on the forensic science side, my work involves human identification. I do a lot of work around forensic archaeology and forensic taphonomy. So understanding post-mortem processes and what happens to bodies after death, and then identifying those individuals. And I've ended up specializing in particularly things like trauma analysis over the years. But I started out as a paleoscientist working in archaeology. As an undergraduate, I spent time working in South Africa. I was lucky enough to go on placement and work with the late great Philip Tobias at Wits University in Johannesburg. And so my early career deals with human evolution, and my PhD is in paleoanthropology, and I'm still involved in that. It's very difficult to give that up, and that influences my work in forensic science to an extent, and vice versa. So I did a lot of work around scanning and visualization, 3D modeling, that kind of thing, computer tomography. And a lot of that, both forensic and paleo practice, has influenced what you're going to see tonight as well. So, a little bit of context. This is a human family tree, or at least an evolutionary set of relationships that was installed at great cost at the Natural History Museum in London. Some of you may well have seen this in South Kensington, and within probably a week of its erection, it was wrong, and it continues to be wrong, much to Chris Stringer's annoyance. But it gives you still gives you a fairly basic overview of how we sit as part of the hominin family tree. And this is us at the top here, Homo sapiens, not Homo sapiens sapiens, but Homo sapiens. And we are a recent phenomenon. We're about 300,000 years old. And we fall into a group or a clade of hominins that we classify these days as essentially the most human-like. They are close relatives, cousins, all now extinct, who would not look too out of place if you met them on the tube or in the street. In most cases, some of them would be much more muscular than ourselves. Some of them would have had very small skulls, small brains, but they shared a common body size to ourselves and general body proportions. And some of them could probably do very similar things to ourselves in terms of the ability to speak, to engage, to feel emotions, and to possess material culture. But we don't quite understand the relationship between all of these fossils and all of these populations, but they're dispersed across much of the old world. But you go further, you go back in time, our ancestors and our cousins become much more ape-like, and you'll meet a couple of them later on. Groups we call the Australopithecines, again now extinct, who are effectively bipedal chimpanzees. As far as we're aware, they didn't possess material culture, but they were probably very sophisticated in terms of their behavior. They are purely confined to the African continent, and these guys lived anywhere between about 5.5 million years ago until quite recent. And they overlap in terms of both their range, but also their existence with hominins that look very similar to ourselves. And the further back in time you go, things become much more ape-like, until by about 7 million years ago, we're looking at the split, the branch, where lineages that go on to give off us separate from the lineage that goes on to become the chimpanzee. So it's the bifurcation between the pan lineage and the hominin lineage. So that gives you a kind of a general overview. To say it's wrong, because some of the specific dates are wrong, and there are actually new hominins to slot in amongst there. It's one of those things in human evolution that you kind of hang up. Oh, we're getting a very bad echo there. Somebody can switch your. Thank you. It's in human evolution. It's a dreadful subject to teach, particularly at times of extensive field work. And running a course in this a couple of years ago, almost literally week by week, I was having to rewrite the lecture slides because of new discoveries and new interpretations. So it's an incredibly dynamic field, but it asks some fundamental basic questions. And we're talking ultimately about ourselves, our origins, and where we fit in the natural world. And so paleoanthropology and human evolution asks a number of particular questions, but particularly in relation to Homo sapiens, those questions relate to effectively who, what, when, why. So questions like, when do we first appear? And we'll talk about that in a minute. Where did the transition between the groups that were ancestral to us and ourselves take place? Did it occur in one region? Was it one continent, or was it widespread and diffuse? And how rapid was it? So how fast did that transition occur? And about the dispersal across the old world, how did that happen? When did that happen? And is our dispersal pattern unique to the fossil record? So those are kind of some of the questions that we've been asking. I mean, really for the last at least 70 years, if not longer, once we recognized that we were part of the natural order of things, and the natural world and the evolution was in fact real. But people like myself are involved in answering addressing some fundamental questions. And one of the big ones, and it's still bedevils paleoanthropology, is what it is that actually makes us human. If we'd have had this lecture 15 years ago or 20 years ago, I'd have probably quite categorically had this slide up and talked about the use of art, the use of controlled use of fire, mobiliary art, cave art, burial, potentially music and ornamentation, as being something that is unique to our species, that was only thought to occur during the Upper Paleolithic, so in the last 35,000 years or so, and to be confined to Homo sapiens. And we now know that's completely wrong. Is that many of the things that we thought make us human are shared with close relatives like the Neanderthals. Certainly the ability to make music, to wear jewelry, to engage with the environment, including with the environment of the dead, is something that's shared with other members and close cousins, such as Neanderthals and a hominin called Homo naledi we'll see in a moment. So all the different things that we thought made us unique and special turn out not to be. And I think that's the critical thing about human evolutionary studies. We're just lucky we're not special, is the main thing. But we've also struggled with some basic questions, such as defining what it is to actually be a human. When I started doing my studies in human evolution, starting my PhD back in the early 90s, we had a very rigid set of definitions for what it was to be anatomically modern. So we'd be looking for this evidence of popping up in the fossil record. We'd be looking at fossils, we'd be looking at variation within modern human populations and trying to come up with a list that defines what it is to be human. This lecture slide has been around in different forms since the days of George W. Bush. It's just been updated for the Trump era now. But these are anatomical characteristics. So it's brain size of greater than 1,350 cubic centimeters. It's possessing a high frontal bone, so it's an expanded frontal and prefrontal cortex of the brain. Expanded parallel-sided cranial vault, so the temporal regions of the brain expand. A rounded occipital bone, the back of the skull, without a transverse torus, so without a big bony attachment for big neck muscles, nuchal neck muscles. A gracile supraorbital torus or a brow ridge compared to other hominins, a flat face, and the presence of a canine fossa, which is the dimple above our canine tooth and below the orbits, and the presence of a true chin. The problem is that doesn't work as a set of definitions either, because we found more about ourselves and we find more fossils, particularly spanning the last 300,000 years or so. We've identified the fact that these features are hypervariable and they occur in different times. Sometimes they disappear, and they do not serve as unique defining characteristics for our species. The only one that probably is a good designator is actually the chin, which bizarrely enough is something that is not shared. The presence of a true chin or trigonum mentale is not shared with other hominins. But it's very difficult on anatomical grounds to define our species. But we potentially do better on genetical grounds, we'll see in a minute, but also on behavioral grounds. And back when I started I started as an undergraduate and then I started my PhD, there was a lot of debate going on, as you'll see in a minute, about the notion of what modern human behavior actually constituted. So this role of art, this role of language, symbolism, and various other things. And it was always very Eurocentric. It was always geared towards the European Upper Paleolithic, which spans the last 35,000 years or so. And it was implicitly quite racist, if we're honest about it. It was something that we acknowledged that modern humans probably evolved in Africa, but they didn't become human, inverted commas, until they left Africa and they arrived in the sunlit uplands of France and Germany and Europe. And then miraculously, they developed the use of language and symbolic architecture and various other things. Whereas researchers such as Alison Brooks and Sally McBrearty, who've been working in East and Central Africa for decades, had realized that many of the characteristics defined modern humans behaviorally had occurred in Africa long before 35,000 years ago. And we began to date and redate many of these sites well in excess of 100,000 years, if not going back further than that. And these are things like we call prepared core technologies, which is fundamental for making points, which you can haft and you can use as sharp things to stick into animals and kill them. Symbolic communication use material artifacts, so pigment use, effectively the precursors of art. Planning in subsistence economies, using sites for long generations at a time, and structuring how you use space and how far you transport raw materials. These are things that were present in the African record long before the European, but European archaeologists very often didn't acknowledge them. So, if you'd have looked at the kind of standard textbook in 1989, or this was a major conference proceedings, but it became the go-to book by Paul Mellers and Chris Stringer. This is 1989 Human Revolution. And on the back of genetic evidence, particularly mitochondrial DNA evidence for diversity in African and non-African populations. Rebecca Kahn and Mark Stoneking and other co-workers had basically identified the fact that we as a species were recent. We were probably, on their estimations, about 250,000 years old, and that our genomes primarily originated in Africa. They're highly diverse within Africa, and that all populations outside of Africa were related back to one single individual, mitochondrially, who they termed Eve. But that was a very simplistic model. It was still Eurocentric, because what it implied was that we evolved in Africa biologically and became culturally modern when we left Africa. And it talked about a late origination of modernity, or the thing that makes us human up here, only occurring when we got to a European context. And it was very progressive and linear. So it was the slow buildup of biological and evolutionary favorable traits, and it emphasized revolution. So biology comes first, revolutionary behavior comes later. By 2006, when we thought about it long and hard again, and on the back of a lot of material that was unearthed around fossils, discoveries of new fossils, reappraisal of old fossils, but particularly a refinement of a lot of genetical techniques, particularly around mitochondrial, then whole nuclear DNA, we began to realize that these simplistic models were wrong, and that effectively, yes, we all originate in Africa, but it was a highly complex structured society. There were pulses of migration out of Africa, and that the behaviors that make us modern originated within the continent, not within Europe. So we took it with us. And it was an evolutionary approach, and it emphasized archaic behavioral diversity. So behavioral diversity in species that were close to us but not us, and in the roots of our genetical stock. And it emphasized archaic introgression. So the bringing in of genomes from other species into ours, or other populations into ours, such as Neanderthals and others. And this kind of approach has continued to this day. And it just gets more and more complex. But at the same time, it's a highly biased and skewed approach, particularly in this critical period referred to as the Middle Pleistocene, which spans about 780,000 to about 130,000 years ago. And this period's marked globally by extremes of climatic variation. It's the ice ages. So you get very cold and dry periods, and you get very warm and wet periods. And the cold and dry are bad for Africa, and the warm and wet are good for Africa. So when it's an ice age, basically the Sahara expands, and that breaks environments up. The Kalahari expands, you get an increase in grassland, you get fissioning and breaking up of habitats. And then you lose the tropical rainforest, and you lose the Central African temperate belts. When we go into an interglacial cycle, as we're in at the moment, then we return to something a bit more approaching normal. But at times, these interglacials have been much warmer and wetter than the one we're currently in, even with the effects of global warming. So you've had this fissioning going on over the last 800,000 years or so in Africa. But we still don't understand how humans fit into that and how evolution actually worked. And part of that is down to the fact that people are, I would say, fundamentally a bit lazy about where they go and do field work. And we've very much concentrated on areas that we know where fossils and archaeology survives. And in East Africa, that's Ethiopia, that's Tanzania, that's Kenya. It's the East African Rift series, from the Great Lakes up in Uganda and the sources of the Nile down through into places like Malawi. It's been a focus of fieldwork in the north, in places like Morocco, and the Mediterranean zone, or the Mediterranean band in North Africa, and right through into the Levantine region. And it's also down in South Africa. But what it's ended up doing is ignoring both the presence of fossil deposits and human occupation, particularly the archaeology of the Stone Age over the last 700,000 or 800,000 years across much of the continent. And part of it, I think, comes down to laziness. We go where we know. Certainly in South Africa, I've returned there because I know the country, I know the sites very, very well. But also it's been down to politics, and it's been down to political inertia of not wanting to go into these regions and explore. And when we have explored these unexplored areas, we find that it's just teeming in archaeology. It's not teeming in hominin fossils yet, but effectively Africa is one massive archaeological Stone Age site of various degrees of density. But we're dealing with these problems of, we focus a lot of attention in discrete areas. But once we start expanding our horizons, and particularly when we start working at the level of landscapes, then we realize that this transition to modernity actually happens really early. It's happening earlier than McBrearty and Brooks thought, perhaps as far back as over 500,000 years ago, when our species didn't exist, but the behavioral conditions for us to become human did. So these are work that's taking place down in Kathu Pan, which is down in Botswana. So the massive series of deposits and landscapes that record archaeology at landscape level, and very similar to some of the stuff I'm going to show you later on. And the work by people like Porat, Michael Shazan, and others, and Jane Wilkins and colleagues, has shown that a lot of the innovations that mark effectively modern behaviors, and if I can kind of hold this up, give you an idea what we're dealing with here. This is a hand axe. This is part of the Acheulean tradition, and it's a stone tool. It's a beautiful piece of worked stone. It's very highly efficient as a cutting tool. This one's made on flint, but a lot of the African ones wouldn't be. And it's an implement that requires foresight and thought to manufacture and great skill. But it's limited in what it can do, and it's big and it's clunky. Think of it a little bit like the Swiss Army knife of the Stone Age, and it falls into what we call the earlier Stone Age tradition, the Acheulean tradition of the African record. And compare that in size to lithics made in what we call the Middle Stone Age. And Middle Stone Age is characterized by technologies such as the use of blades. It's also characterized by something called prepare core technology, where you take a large lump of rock and you trim it in certain ways to produce a series of points or fluted lithic items, which are ideal for, they're much smaller, you get more of them from the same core, but they're also ideal for hafting. So it appears to be that around 500,000 to 400,000 years ago, there's a transition going from these larger Acheulean stone tools towards much more formal ones that are smaller, but can actually be hafted then and turned into effectively pointy killing things. And it may be that this is the kind of technology that's driving our evolution in terms of behavior and then biology. And a couple of years ago, this was clearly evidenced at a series of sites in East Africa around the African lakes. And this is work that's been going on for 20 or 30 years before this was published by Rick Potts and his team. Again, it includes people like Alison Brooks and others. And this was a series of papers published in 2018 where around the Kapthurin Formation in East Africa, which is a series of intercalated lake horizons that recorded very, very good archaeological signatures, evidence for bone working and butchery practices, but importantly, they contain evidence for climatic transition. And what they indicated is around about 300,000 years ago, or just before, there's one of these drying events, and East Africa begins to dry proportionally. You get an increase in grassland, and a lot of the great static lakes begin to dry up, and the river systems change. And in that situation, hominins, like any other animal, can do one or two things. They can adapt or they can die. And it appears that the hominins in that part of Africa adapted, and they went from this hand axe technology through into very, very complex Middle Stone Age, likely with hafting and long distance procurement of some of these beautiful lithics. And it goes from being very much a contingency based approach to your environment. So you take the rocks where you find them, you make your hand axes, to no, I want that one, I want these beautiful chalcedonies or these obsidians, and they're 300 kilometers away, but I'm still going to use those for whatever reason, whether it's purely technological or symbolic or whatever. But it also marks the first use of things like pigments or the collection of ochres and pigment types, which may be used for symbolic purposes. So they may be used as part of art or of decoration, cosmetics, etc. But they can also be used in the manufacture of adhesives and glues, particularly ones that are casein based. So it may be that it's a functional issue and then art came later, who knows, but the transition is there. And that coincides with a reappraisal of fossils that were found in Morocco at a site called Reappraisal, which was originally classified as a Neanderthal many years ago, but has been reappraised and redated and is now classified as a member of our own species. And new fossils were found that fit very, very structurally within the robust end of Homo sapiens, but still within our species. So the presence of an anatomical chin, and also structure of the internal structure of the skull as well, the endocast of the brain, and that was redated from about 130,000 years originally to over 300,000 years at this site, and that coincided with the appearance of Middle Stone Age or these point and blade technologies at Yebelehud as well. So subsequent to that, there's been a big reappraisal of the genetical evidence, the archaeological evidence, and we've done away with this idea that our species evolved in any one particular region of Africa at any one time. So effectively what we're now talking about is continental complexity and continental gene flows, ultimately leading to the evolution of highly complex stylized technologies, art, decoration, bone tools, and ultimately to things that we fully recognize as being modern symbolic behaviors. And to bring this absolutely bang smack up to date, this was published yesterday, and this is looking at the genetical evidence for the origins of Homo sapiens from a variety of different sources. And it certainly appears to back up. This is Anders Bergström, Chris Stringer, Alan Skerry, and Pontus Skoglund, so Naturalist Museum and the Crick Institute and Max Planck, looking at the diversity of genetic signatures within Africa and outside of Africa. And it appears to back up this notion that diversity within Africa is a continuous genomic surface in a way. And that matches what we find in terms of the archaeology. But the things begin to change when we leave Africa. But effectively, the African record, both archaeologically and genetically, underpins everything that comes later. But we're already fully anatomically modern, genetically modern, and behaviorally modern by 50 to 60,000 BP, when we effectively migrated out and occupied the bulk of the old world. So it's that kind of idea about migration I want to talk to you about. And I mean, effectively, I've been involved in studies of landscape archaeology, so non-site-based archaeology, for a significant part of my professional career. Oops, hello? Somebody talking? Nope. Okay. Significant part of my professional career. And the notion of landscape is something that's always fascinated me. So the impact that where we work, where we live, the place that we occupy, that it's not just about economy, it's not just about a source of food, but it has more going for it. So territories or territoire are important things. And this kind of builds on the work of people like Louis Binford, who was active in the 1960s and 70s, developing something called middle range theory. It builds on the work of the Kalahari Research Group, who looked at the lifeways of the San and the Hadza, and other indigenous populations in southern Africa. And there's been a resurgence of work around looking at hunter-gatherers and how indigenous peoples make a living and how they handle landscape. And there's a relationship basically between the productivity. It's not a complete fixed relationship because it depends on other factors, but between productivity of an environment, so how rich it is in terms of biodiversity and seasonality of foodstuffs, and the size of your range. And it can range, so hunter-gatherer groups can be quite sedentary. They exist within a few tens of kilometers for much of the year, radiating or moving around different parts of that environment, maybe as watercourses change over the year, standing water is lost, or as animals migrate, or as plants come into their seasonal bloom, etc. Whereas some landscapes, which maybe are not as productive in terms of their biomass, the home range of the total area that's exploited by humans can be enormous. It can be thousands of square kilometers, and it can involve multiple residential moves of staying in one place for perhaps a week or so, moving to the next encampment, and so on and so forth. And this always amazed me. I started out my work in South Africa down on the edge of the Kalahari at the site of Taung, and it was just the notion of distance and between sites and between areas that had been used until quite recently by humans. And it's the notion that in what's essentially a featureless landscape, and it is very much featureless down there, that humans knew where to return precisely at certain times of the year, and their strategies got them through dry seasons, through wet seasons, and allowed them to flourish and be successful across thousands of years until Europeans arrived and pretty much wiped them all out. And this is something that always amazed me, and particularly in relation to just the density of the archaeological record that you found down the Kalahari. So landscape is something that's always stuck with me, and that's what I'm going to try and get across to you today. And there is an entire branch of archaeology referred to as landscape archaeology. And it very much deals with symbolic landscapes, such as Stonehenge. But nowadays we begin to recognize that a lot of this archaeology has applications, understanding it into hunter-gatherer societies and into effectively non-Western, non-European contexts. And there's an excellent edition of the journal Evolutionary Anthropology a couple of years ago that looked at landscapes and mobility from an evolutionary perspective in humans and in non-human animals and hunter-gatherer populations. Now, it's well worth reading. If anybody wants a citation for it, I can send it to you. But this talks about the notion of landscapes and salient features in landscapes. And it's one of these things that always has struck me as really important. And as somebody who, I think I have a fairly good innate sense of direction, where it hasn't got me killed yet, is the notion of how we recognize landmarks in an otherwise largely featureless landscape, and how we move between waypoints and landmarks through that landscape at different times, and how we expend energy in it. And so, for instance, I'm sure you're all familiar with the notion of Stonehenge and the debate that's going on now about the tunnel that's being put in with the removal of the is it the A380? But Stonehenge isn't just Stonehenge. It's not just the monument. It's the cursus that's around it. It's the series of burial mounds. It's the henge proper. So this is actually the least interesting bit about it. It's the henge proper, the bank and ditch system. But it's a landscape that extends 50, 60, 70 kilometers. And all of that landscape fits together. So it has different shades and different structures of meaning that were developed over millennia. And that's what we refer to as landscape salience. And there are three kind of different types of salience. There's perceptual, get the word out, which is to do with the area, shape, color, and visual prominence of different features in a landscape. There's structural, which is the kind of the habitat patches and the corridors that you move through to move between topographic features in different parts of the landscape. And then finally, there's the semantic, which is the meaning of what landscape means to the person, to the individual, the community, and the importance of its history and the objects and features within it. And a clear example of that is the misappropriation. Those of you who are familiar with Robin Hood, Prince of Thieves, this is supposed to be just outside Sherwood Forest in Nottinghamshire, but instead this is Hadrian's Wall, and this feature is actually now been referred to as the Robin Hood Prince of Thieves feature within the UNESCO World Heritage Site. So a cultural misappropriation of what is a semantic feature of landscape salience. And humans have been both culturally and biologically adapting to landscape and the environment in which they sit for pretty much our entire evolutionary journey. And to give you some idea of the potential effects on this, or at least in terms of what is opened up by a change in body plan within early hominins. This is from a National Geographic magazine article that coincided with the publication of Homo naledi, which is a very small-brained, both primitive and advanced-looking hominin who lived, or at least in terms of the Rising Star cave site in South Africa, was around from about 330,000 to about 250,000 years ago. And you can see that Naledi's got a very, it's quite tall, long, lanky legs, long arms, slightly bizarre-looking thorax, and a non-human face, and a very, very small brain. But this is a hominin that From the projects that I was involved in, we demonstrated that they were disposing of their dead about 250,000 years ago, at the same time that our species was effectively evolving or becoming Homo sapiens. But this kind of long nilotic body plan with a short thorax, long lower limbs, short upper limbs, and an enlarged brain case is something that first appears around about 1.8, 1.9 million years ago. And we see it in Africa first with the species Homo ergaster, which when it leaves Africa evolves into Homo erectus. We see it in our own species, Homo sapiens, and we see it in species like Neanderthals and others, Homo antecessor, and pretty much everything that's on our lineage that's younger than about 1.8 million years. And that's very different from the chimp-like body proportions that are seen in the Australopithecines, where they've got short legs, they've got long arms, they've got funnel-shaped rib cages, so a big gut, probably for the digestion of low-quality foodstuffs, and relatively small brains. And adaptations that are geared both to walking on the ground, but also in climbing, in moving through potentially canopy or climbing above the ground. And that's very different once you hit Homo ergaster, where this is an animal, a hominin, a cousin of ours, who was as much adapted for walking and running as anything else. And that may have coincided with a change in diet, a change in ecological niche, and the expansion of foodstuffs that eating meat brings about, and the particularly fats and triglycerides and various other things that leads to an adaptation for a shorter, more efficient, more carnivore-like gut. So we know that there are adaptations that are certainly geared towards expansion in landscapes with ergaster, and that's kind of what we see, is that humans start to range more, hominins start to range more, and ultimately range so far as to occupy every conceivable part of every conceivable continent. But now I want to shift to Makapansgat and talk you through how these kind of understandings or these ideas of the effects of landscape and evolution go hand in hand together. And this is my office. This has been my office, the Makapansgat UNESCO World Heritage Site and its environs for best part of 20 odd years. And it is one of my most favorite places on the planet. It's found in Limpopo province in South Africa. So it's north of Johannesburg and Pretoria, about 3 hours drive north. And it contains a series of cave sites, which span about 3.3 million years to present. And it's one of the most continuous records in a small area of human evolution in South Africa. And it was given UNESCO World Heritage status in the late noughties. It has fossil sites that include sites that produced Australopithecus africanus, members of archaic Homo and our own species, and archaeology that spans at least 500,000 years. But more importantly, it's not just the cave sites, it presents a vast archaeological landscape that humans have exploited for at least 500,000 years or more. So this is the UNESCO World Heritage Site, otherwise known as Cradle of Humankind. It spans from Makapan at the north to the core sites of around Johannesburg. So you may be familiar with Sturtfontein, Swartkrans, Kromdraai, Malapa, Rising Star, they're all in this area. And down at the foot of the World Heritage Site is the Tawong site, which was the first, provided the first evidence for our evolution in Africa with the Tawong child. But the valley itself, I say it's in Limpopo province, it's a Y-shaped geological feature. It sits within a very mountainous landscape, rising to about 2,200 meters above sea level. And there are a series of fault-controlled systems along these two Y-shaped valleys that are just dotted with cave systems, which are phreatic dissolution chambers within this limestone environment. I'm really going to talk today about the major one, which is the Cave of Hearths, but a whole series of caves spanning from about 3.3 million years ago with the Limeworks cave site, and to caves that are forming quite recently and have occupation dating back to the African Iron Age, so in the last 1,000 years, and in some cases still being used for animist rituals and various other things today. But Bachman itself has lured archaeologists and paleoanthropologists since the 1920s and 1930s. And kind of for South Africa, it's kind of a who's who of the discipline. So people like Philip Tobias, my late mentor, worked there. His mentor, Raymond Dart, is intimately involved with the valley. People like James Kitching, Alan Hughes, and the Revel Mason, perhaps one of the greats of African archaeology, worked there. A lot of these were involved with the creation and proselytization of the something called the Osteodontogratic culture. Some of you might be familiar with this in terms of 2001: A Space Odyssey, so killer ape men. But others have been scientists who've been involved in geology, such as Tim Partridge, Julie Maguire and Brian Maguire, who were very much involved in understanding the ecology of this beautiful area, and other archaeologists and paleoanthropologists who've been working there until quite recently. And it is a beautiful place to work. It's a stunning landscape. And it sits within, I say, this very, very mountainous region, just outside of the town now known as Mokopane. Before it was known as Potgietersrus, but with a transition to democratic government, it's changed and it's been reflects its original African name. But the oops, sorry, that was my alarm to give the dog his tablets. But the site itself sits up here, and within this highly mountainous landscape, so a series of crests and ridges, which you'll see a little bit more of in a moment. But the principal geology is something called the Malmani Dolomite. So that's the limestone formation that makes up the bulk of the valley, and it sits on top of Precambrian Black Reef quartzites and other quartzite systems. So this is the famous red cliffs at the top here, and above that you move up into the escarpment here, which looks down over the Petersburg Plain, or now the Polokwane Plain. And in the far north, you've got Botswana and Zimbabwe up in the Mapani Felt, and great sites such as Great Zimbabwe are found, and Makangupwe are in that belt to the far north. But the principal geology is limestone, and you get caves forming within this, and it's interbedded with cherts, with cave breccias, so naturally concrete infills, but chert sandstones and shales, which provide, particularly the quartzites and the cherts provide materials for raw material use for stone tools, and have been actively used for at least the last 500,000 years or so. Now it is a World Heritage Site, UNESCO World Heritage Site, and it's administered by the Environment Agency. But this is another aerial shot here. The major sites are basically confined to this grabens. This is a fault-controlled geological feature. So there are faults that run down either side of this landscape, and effectively the base of the valley has dropped down and slipped, and is now infilled with various sediments and colluvium that's come down off the hills. And you've got a long central valley, which is known as the Svartkrans Valley, not to be confused with the one actually just outside of Johannesburg. And then you have an offshoot, which is the Makapan Valley. So this is Svartkrans, and this is Makapan, and it's another series of fault-controlled structures. To the mouth of the valley, you've got the Limeworks Caves, which is the Australopithecine site. And then to the north of that, in the main Makapan Valley, you've got what's called the Cave of Haas complex, and that's where our work really focused on. Limeworks Cave itself is around about 3.3 to 3 million years old, depending on who you talk to. And it comprises a bunch of deposits that were, to use the technical term, hoiked out by lime miners in the late 1800s and the early 1900s. And the caves themselves, the Limeworks Cave is massive, and within that massive system you've got intercalated infills which span almost the entire formation period of the cave, and lots of stalagmites and stalactites that are formed during wet periods. And those are what the miners were after. They weren't after fossils, they weren't after anything else that was in the cave, they were just after these flow stones. And that was being used in gold extraction in the gold industry in Johannesburg. But while taking the flow stones out, what they ended up doing was exposing ancient fossil deposits, so the remains of animals that have found their way into various natural death trap situations, or we now know hyena dens and carnivore dens, spanning a very considerable period of time. And the dumps that the miners produced were eventually sorted by students of Raymond Dart and Philip Tobias, and a lot of the material is still there. So these are the lime miners' dumps, and they are full of fossils, including potentially hominin fossils. And these days, it's not actively worked as a site, and there are still extensive fossil deposits at the lime works proper. But what it has yielded over the years, in work of people like Dart and Tobias, is a number of hominin fossils and thousands of non-hominin remains of antelopes, of carnivores, of birds, crocodiles, and other things. But, excuse me, when Raymond Dart, who was professor of anatomy at University, looked at the fossils that were coming out of the site, they were broken, they were very often blackened and stained, and he slowly began to come up with the idea that the features he was seeing on these fossils, and this is one of the Makapansgat fossils. This is MLD2. It's a lower jaw, attributed to Australopithecus africanus, which is the same species, the little town child here. But Dart came up with the idea that all the different breakage patterns on bone, all the blackening was actually caused by hominins being predatory and dragging animals and killing them into the cave. At the same time, they were also producing art, and this is the famous Makapan pebble, which is purported to be the first representative art of a human face. I think personally it's more like to be pareidolia. We're seeing a face where one doesn't exist, so otherwise known as Jesus on toast syndrome. But Dart came up with this hypothesis he termed the Osteodontogratic Road EK, and over the course of the next 30 odd years, if not longer, he produced a series of books and articles that effectively attributed all the patterns of damage seen in the fossil deposits of Makapan to the predatory Australopithecines. With quite a fanciful series of monographs, he talks about how you can use almost every single part of an animal skeleton to kill something with. So you can use the scapula and the pelvis as axes to kill things. You can use them as clubs. You can use them as pointy stabbing implements. You can use horn cores, so that the base of antelope horns, as stabbing implements, and you can use things like antelope jaws as sawing implements, as saws. One of the things that we used to get students to do is to try to saw things with sheep or antelope jaws, and believe me, it doesn't work. But that didn't stop Dart. So in 1953, in one of the books, The Prairie Transition from Ape to Man, he talks about man's predecessors being confirmed killers, carnivorous creatures that seized living quarries by violence, battered them to death, tore apart their broken bodies, dismembered them limb from limb, slaking their ravenous thirst with the hot blood of victims and greedily devouring livid, writhing flesh. They don't write things like that anymore. You certainly don't get away with language like that in nature. And what he ended up doing was generating an entire culture around these predatory ape men that had no basis in scientific fact. But it did lead to the kind of work that I was doing at Makapan, because out of this came the science that we call taphonomy, or actualistic taphonomy, or the laws of burial, particularly as applied to South African cave systems. And it really started with this amazing chap, Charles Kimberlin Brain, or Bob Brain, who was not convinced by Dart's work, and had observed what we call actualistically, so by going and doing field work and observing how animals worked in the wild, that hyenas were prolific accumulators of bone in caves, and that leopards in particular, particularly when they would carry their prey up into trees to outcompete other predators. If these trees were over sinkholes or over cave openings, then as the animal decomposed or was eaten, bones fell down and moved into the cave system, so were incorporated into cave deposits. So these days we talk about this being most parsimoniously explained ODK by being carnivore accumulations, and in case of the hominins themselves, not as being mighty predators, but actually as being cat food. So this is just for historical note. This is actually some of the original material on display at WITS, on which Dart based his hypotheses, and some of the archaeological material and ethnographic material he used to try and justify that. but evidence has accumulated through behavioral studies with across Africa and elsewhere that indicates that this is more likely, these deposits are more likely to be caused by carnivores. So that's the Limeworks cave. The next biggest cave or series of complex of caves are the ones that we focused on archaeologically, and that's the Cave of Haas complex. So called because the Cave of Haas was purported, time of its discovery, to have evidence for the earliest use of fire by hominids. But it's part of a big cave system comprising Cave of Haas, the Cave of Gwassa, or historic caves it used to be known, and two smaller caves, Hyena Mandible and Rainbow Cave. But it sits on the side of the valley and is now has an open-air museum component to it, and you can have site tours. But the cave itself is part of a big complex, and it's been open for a number of years and used by humans until quite recently. So, for instance, the Cave of Haas is sitting down here. This is the red cliffs would be up to this end of the valley, and this is looking out towards the Limeworks and Svartkrans. Historic cave was used by indigenous Ndebele tribes up until the mid-1800s. And when white settlers first came into the area and established themselves in the local town of Potgietersrus, there was various altercations to do with water rights and access to land. And the European settlers, the Afrikaners, really weren't terribly polite. They were certainly not non-violent, and hostilities ensued, which led to killing on both sides, but particularly the driving of an Ndebele community into the caves in hiding in 1853, when they went in and were eventually starved out, shot out, and exploded out in 1854, with the loss potentially of around 3,000 individuals. And this is now a historic monument, and effectively is an archaeological mass grave in some respects, which remains are still found within the cave systems. This is a mummified child. This is a clinical CT volume. So it's false color, but it's a mummified body of a child that was discovered far back at the cave system in an underchamber in the early 1990s. It was. But the major cave, from my perspective, is the Cave of Haas, and that's a cave that was dug not by ourselves, but by teams of archaeologists, started out by Guy Gardner, but mainly the work of Revel Mason, who died last year, who's one of the most important, influential archaeologists working certainly in South Africa, but I think you can argue across the African continent as a whole. And he dug this cave site and identified a series of sequences that spanned the earlier Stone Age through the Middle Stone Age into the later Stone Age, and then into the historical period when we start to get first farmers. The Acheulean Middle Stone Age transition was particularly important at this site because it would have marked this transitory period between archaic hominins and the first anatomically modern humans in the area. And over the course of a number of years, he basically took the entire site out, or what he thought was the entire site. This is it from the opposing hill. It's basically a long slit across the hillside with a big collapse on top. And this is filled up with 20 or 30 meters of deposit over what we now know to be about 500,000 years. And Mason took pretty much all of that out. But the thing about African archaeology is people fixate on sites, whereas when we started working there, we realized that the bit between sites, the landscape, was actually a huge important bit. So we actually started the first landscape study of its kind in South Africa, a fieldwork around there with my colleague Anthony Sinclair from Liverpool University from 1996-2001. And the aim was to basically contextualize the Cave of Haas and that transition from archaic to modern behaviors. We knew that there were hominins there. There's a hominin mandible and a radius. It's one of the bones of the forearm, which are not anatomically modern, but they're certainly not as robust as many other hominin finds in Africa from the Acheulean. But it's trying to understand that transition that's going on both biologically and culturally. But the thing was that people had fixated on where the original sites were, and they had identified effectively 4 major localities. And we instigated a series of field walking and exploration. And by the end of 2001, we found 5 additional new major sites, and we had 31 major localities and over 400 surface sites, primarily Acheulean and Middle Stone Age, and began to realize that an awful lot more was going on in the archaeology of this area than Mason had first identified. So these are some of the types of artifacts that we found, including massive prepared Victoria West cores, which are used to produce points and flakes, and some of them potentially as rough outs for hand axes. But it's a much more complex archaeology than Mason had first identified. We also began to look at the presence for fire at the cave site, and what was originally classified as the original hearths on which the cave was named. We tested for presence of chemical traces of fire and the signatures of burning that take place both in bone and in sediments, and found out that basically there wasn't a hearth there at all. This is actually fossilized colophane, otherwise known as bat poo. And this is many meters of fossilized deposit that's built up that has never been burnt at all. But we were able to look at magnetic reversals in the sequence, and at least know that the principal deposits formed after about 500,000 years ago, but also to identify the fact that there were burning features within the cave higher up in the sequence, but also that there were there was evidence of butchered and burnt bone and the high temperature burning of material going on within the cave site. And this gives you an idea of what Mason took out. So when he arrived at the cave, this was full almost to the surface up here. He excavated this down, and you'll see that there are continuation of chambers below this, but Mason then backfilled or put material into this because he thought he'd reached the base of the archaeology. And one of the things that we were able to do was demonstrate that below this level, there was indeed archaeology going down, and there's archaeology continuing under the current historic cave, and they're part of a big interconnected cave system. So we did limited trenching and found some evidence for in situ artifacts and bone material, so fossilized bone. And that included some quite interesting ecological facts as well. So we're actually looking at barbules of feathers here on the surface of a stone tool preserved that's at least 250,000 years old. So evidence of quite the processing certainly of bird remains, feathers, carcasses, etc. And when we go back, hopefully in the next digging season, we can actually get out there and start to open these deposits up again. We can start to apply new techniques around ancient DNA, sedimentary DNA, and proteomics to these deposits. But I say we were the first excavation to really kind of concentrate on the role of landscape. And we did that effectively by walking and understanding the impact that walking in a really complex mountainous landscape has on people. And we were able to rely on an army of student volunteers and excavators, and they look relatively comfortable at this point, but some of these are actually wearing rectally inserted thermocouples and chest monitors to measure their heart rate and their temperature. So we're looking at thermodynamics and landscape movement dynamics, and tying that into the fine spots of archaeology using, at the time, some of the earliest GPS systems handheld. But we also excavated and understood what was going on in the landscape as well, and tied this in with aerial survey, including the first use of, we tried to do photogrammetry from digital cameras. So this is actually taken with, believe it or not, the first 1 megapixel digital camera available on the market. And the idea was to tie all this in with a GIS database and a landscape modeling system. We used a DRISI, and that was my first painful lesson in never let a geologist choose a GIS system for you, because we've 20 years later having huge problems reading the data. But from that, we were able to produce GIS models and dynamic terrain models, which told us that where fine sites were, particularly related to large cutting tools and large flakes of stone, that it was down to the presence of raw materials, so particularly high quality raw materials for making hand axes, and between what we had in terms of geomorphological evidence for presence of water, of where the potential was standing water, but also water courses and navigational routes within the mountainous system, but also outside of it. And we were able to disprove a lot of Mason's original ideas about the transition between the Acheulean and the Middle Stone Age, and showing that it wasn't a transitional period, it was a clear demarcation and a clear break between the two systems. But I want to give you an idea now of what landscape is like there. And what you're seeing here is a Google Earth virtual reality model. It may make you slightly sick, hopefully not. This is something I was able to do yesterday. And what you're seeing here is the valley, but more importantly, we're going outside the valley, and you're actually following lines of effectively navigational markers, navigational lines, and lines of least resistance that we have traversed in field walking, going out from the valley to its environs. This tool, the use of virtual reality and of Google Earth has been it's been revolutionary from my perspective in understanding the relationship between archaeological features and the landscape in which they sit. And the one thing we do know from the work we've done is that the landscape hasn't changed that much in terms of the last 500,000 years, or at least the major routeways through it. So what you're looking here is moving out of the valley, and you're looking then southwards towards the town of Makapansgat. And this is a series of hills that form a crest of limestone to the west of Makapan Valley. Now you're looking towards an area referred to as the Percy Fife Nature Conservancy, and this is basically part of the Stryport Mountains, which is an offshoot of this beautiful area to the east called the Waterberg, and it's a very impassable mountain system. You're looking north then to Mapani Felton up towards Zimbabwe and Botswana. But we're going to go for a little ride in a moment. We're going to move away from Makapan Valley, which you can see over here, going towards the town of Mokopane, and something rather impressive and rather spectacular at the end of it. So you're looking here at the Waterberg Mountains, which there are only effectively 3 passes through the mountains, one of which is this great valley here, or the Macolaquena, within which the town of Mokopane now sits. And you're looking back at the landscape, and there's Makapansgat and the Red Cliffs, and you're looking at these visual markers and visual cues that would have been available to hominins living in the landscape at the time. And so we're going northwards now, southwestwards, towards a series of hills in the Etelup region. And I'm actually going to cut this short in just a second. And we're going to stop there. And what you're seeing here is now potentially one of the richest and most important archaeological landscapes in South Africa, or within Africa. And this is a project we have reinstigated as a consequence of heritage under threat. So I was brought into this to comment on plans to build the world's largest platinum mine bang smack on top or adjacent to a World Heritage Site. But it was also in a region that was affected by sand extraction, particularly illegal extraction. So Makapan Valley is down here. What you've just been looking at from the video is here. So we flew over this region. And there was a huge platinum mine to the north called Mapela. And they were planning, or Plat Reef Mine were planning on putting in a mine here that would affect a region at least as large as this. And the original environmental impact assessment said there was no archaeology there. There are people living there now, but there's no archaeology, and therefore there'd be no cultural impact. And myself and my colleague Amanda Esterhazen thought that was a bit suspect, as we both know that the area was just teeming in archaeology, including historical and Iron Age graves, homesteads, circumcision sites, so currently used ritual sites, and Stone Age archaeology. And we visited a number of the localities and found evidence for early Iron Age occupation, which probably around about the 1000 AD mark, so some of the first farmers coming into the area. And when we got out to one of the sites, at a site called Shamahansi, which was the site of illegal sand extraction, so this had been dug away for use as building sand, there were lithics lying on the surface. It was actually my wife that first spotted them and said, "Are those stone tools?" And yes, indeed, they were stone tools lying on what's called a calcrete surface, so a carbonate surface. And they were Middle Stone Age in date, and many of them were pristine and occurring in densities that I had not seen in that part of South Africa before. And it transpires that what we've got are a series of calcrete exposures or pans and erosion features, which we identified at the time 6 major ones, and all of them are teaming in archaeology. So this leads us to set up something referred to as the Makapansgat Archaeological Landscape Survey, or MALP. We've got 4 basic activities: fly, walk, predict, and truth. And I'll explain what that means in a minute. But what you're looking at here from aerial drone footage is anything that is buff colored or pale colored is an archaeological deposit and an archaeological site, and of incredible density. So our work there is we actually stay at within a nature conservancy. So we do wildlife studies as part of this. So we've got animals like kudu, water buffalo, giraffe, and various others in this beautiful landscape. And it's really rough. We stay on a 4-star game reserve, and it's really, really terribly hard to do field work there, but I do like it. But the important thing we begin to realize is that for the first time in many years, we've actually got a landscape that is both extant, that it's the current landscape, and it's a landscape that people are living in and working on and driving over, but at the same time there's an emerging paleo landscape. So you can see here this differential of erosion, and particularly the exposure of these calcary deposits or beds beneath that. And that's a huge thing, because most of the Stone Age archaeology is at depth. In 1999, to the north of Makapansgat, we discovered bands of Stone Age archaeology, but at kind of 3 to 5 meters or more, only exposed by erosion features, so these things called dongas, which are seasonal drainage features. The same thing we're finding at this area around Shamahansi. And so the project really isn't actually terribly exciting in terms of, it's not rocket science, it's actually observational, and it's involved in walking across the landscape, looking for stone tools, identifying them and marking their position, with the aim of, for full excavation, going back and looking at this in more detail. But we've identified a whole series of features spanning many square kilometers. In 2018, this included the first evidence for earlier Stone Age or Ashland technology, and in 2019, in situ deposits in soil horizons and areas of refitting, so where you can actually put stone tools back together again. And that's hugely important, because it means A, you've got a surface that hasn't moved much, and B, you can refit them to understand the behaviors that constructed them. And through the use of field walking and use of drones in particular, we basically realized that we've got a whole series of now eroding complex horizons that span potentially about 500,000 years or more. And these are calcrete bands, and geologists will tell you that there are, as far as I know, there are 3 different types of calcretes. Some of them are caused by occurring in ponds or precipitation at the base of water features, but others are caused by the loss of water and precipitation within soils. So they actually occur within soil horizons as a result of drying out. We've got intercalated ones of these, and they're intercalated with sand, Kalahari sands, and other windblown material. But we do have evidence of primary or near primary residual landscapes, and that's hugely exciting, because that means we can excavate them. So these types of deposits, the work on these fits back into the work that Revel Mason did in the 1960s in the same area. And he excavated these, but without a lot of the spatial technology that we have, and also I think quite the same understanding of technology and how that relates to landscape formation. But these are sites like Schoonheit, Blauwbank, and Kaltbank, which look remarkably similar. He excavated in the 1950s. Some of them were excavated before then. And we're planning on going back to reopen Mason's excavations at the same sites in the next couple of years. But what we are doing basically, just to finish up, is look at a number of different things at landscape level. So we're looking at the location of where hominins are, and that's very important. But also we're looking at how they acquire their raw materials. And it's a much more complex web of raw materials than we find in Makapan. So they're coming in from further afield, and they're a different type, and they're much more, in some respects, they use the technical term pretty. They're different colors, they're different mechanical properties, but they're very different from we find at Makapansgat. And we're also looking at what hominins are doing at these individual sites, the scale of what they're doing, the dating of it, using optical luminescence and other techniques. And then more importantly is how this relates to big areas of activity, to the Kalahari to the north and the Springbok Flats to the south. And this is a passageway through the Waterberg Mountains between these incredibly biodiverse ecotones that would have existed at the time of these hominins were present, and the Makapansgat River, which has been a perennial water source for probably at least 500,000 years. But we're also involved in giving back to the community. So we're getting involved in heritage engagement. People like Peter Molepo here, who is one of the custodians or tour guides at the area, who wants to engage with us and wants to become an archaeologist and learn how these things work. So actually capacity building and empowerment and decolonization of what's going on there is vitally important. And adapting new ways of doing this. So bringing in new techniques such as 3D modeling, using UAVs, landscape, remote sensing, virtual reality and augmented reality to basically allow you to visit the sites from the comfort of your armchair, although we would prefer you went there and spent money with the local communities, but also exchanging knowledge back to the communities and vice versa. And those are some of the people that are involved. And if you are interested in the project, keep an eye on us for MALP over the next couple of years. But also if you're interested in getting involved at any different level, because we are looking at landscape ecology, evolution, as well as the stone tools and artifacts, then you're more than welcome to get in touch. And apologies for going slightly over.